Welcome to the Brain Injury Association of New York State's webinar, Return to Learn, Supporting Students Returning to the Classroom Post-Concussion. I am Carla Giovaniello, Brain Injury Training and Services Project Director here at the Association. Thank you for joining us. Before we begin, a few housekeeping details. Because of limited time, we ask that you please hold your questions until the end of the presentation. During the question and answer session, questions can be submitted via the question text box. The text box option should be visible to you on your GoToWebinar toolbar on your desktop. If you are having trouble viewing this option, please contact Citrix Tech Support at 1-800-263-6317. Again, that number is 1-800-263-6317. This number should also be visible on your toolbar. Our speaker will do his best to answer questions in the order that they are received. Any questions he is unable to address may be submitted via email to the association. As always, we will be recording this webinar session and plan to post it along with the presentation slides to our website, www.bianys.org. Information about contacting the association and viewing the webinar will be provided in a follow-up email after the presentation has ended. My contact information will also be included in those follow-up messages if you need to contact me. Before I turn the microphone over to Brian, let us begin with a quick poll to see who is in our audience today. Please take a moment to answer the question. Give you about 10 more seconds. All right, I'm getting ready to close the poll now and share the results. All right. Excellent. I am, as always, I've been saying this in the last several webinars, interested to know who that other population is. If you could just send me a quick little comment about who you are, I'd greatly appreciate it so I can tailor some of the future polls to meet everybody. Thank you for your participation. I love seeing the variety in our audience. It is great to see, and I want to thank you all again for your participation and for helping to spread the word about our monthly webinars. It is with sincere pleasure that I introduce our presenter for today now, Brian Rieger. Brian is Chief Rehabilitation Psychologist and Director of the Upstate Concussion Center at SUNY Upstate Medical University in Syracuse, New York. He is a member of the New York State Public High School Athletic Association Concussion Management Team and is the Psychology Liaison to the Safety Committee. Brian, good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Carla. And good afternoon to everyone in attendance. Thank you to the Brain Injury Association for having me back again to talk about my favorite subject, the academic consequences of concussion and how we can support students struggling with those consequences. What we're going to do today is review a little bit of background information about a concussion. Concussion is in the news all the time now, so probably most of you have some familiarity with that, but we're going to review that to give a little background to set us up to focus then on a description of what kinds of problems we see in students who are recovering from concussion, and then some discussion about how to help those students in a variety of different ways. I like to begin presentations that I do with information from the real experts, the folks who've actually gone through this. And so I have a video that I'm going to play of Corey, who's a 12-year-old girl who dove headfirst into a concrete wall at a basketball practice. There were pads on the wall, but they didn't come all the way down to the floor of the gym. And her 12-year-old head fit right underneath them and banged into the concrete. And we were videotaping her. We videotaped her at about 4 months after her injury, and she was still struggling. She had made a lot of progress, but she was by no means fully recovered and still struggling with things. I'm going to play this video. When Carla and I tested this, unfortunately Carla could not see the video piece of this. She could only hear the audio. So I apologize in advance if that's the case for you as well. And any comments about, I have a couple of other videos I'd like to play, but if it's really not coming through very well, please let Carla and I know, and we can just skip those. But let me give this a try. This is Corey talking about her experience with the injury, and we particularly were focused on what it was like for her in terms of her schoolwork and going back to school. So here she is.
I was at my gym in my school, but it was after school hours between 5 and 6. And I was running because I was on defense, and we were doing a defense drill. And right when I was about to jump to try to stuff somebody, I tripped and I dove right into the wall. I didn't slide, I dove, and I hit like right about here. And after that, I saw blood for about a second. It might have been a little long, but for me, it seemed like a second. And then I just held up and started crying because the pain was just the worst, really bad. When I got home, I was laying on my couch, my dad had to carry me in, and I kept asking if I could go to bed because after the accident, I was very, very tired. So I kept asking if I could go to bed, and I was tired of doing it.
Brian, I apologize. We do have a few people saying that they're having trouble seeing the video or hearing. So unfortunately, we might have to skip this. But if you want to summarize, I know I always love hearing about personal experiences with the actual students. If you could share that, I'm sure everyone would definitely appreciate it.
How about if I just let this one play and then I'll skip the next ones?
Okay.
Would that be okay?
Yeah, I think it's varying with the audio, so I think some people can hear and some cannot.
Okay.
Some of the work that I would be fine with was very hard to do, and I couldn't get it done. I would have to ask a lot of questions, and people would look at me and would say, "Oh, you don't have a problem, you're fine," and it would really hurt me more than it would have before the accident because I am hurt. My grades were going down. I'm usually the lowest, the 80, high 80s are usually my lowest, and then 90 and above are my usual. And I've been, and I'm still, I've been getting 70s. I'm not sure about 60s, but 70s, 80s. I can't eat in the cafeteria because that's what loud noises are very, very.
Brian, I'm having some comments. People are unable to hear it, and they want to know if you could summarize. Yeah, I'm sorry.
That's okay, I will.
We hoped for the best on this.
Yeah. Okay, folks. My understanding is that that video and audio were not coming through very well, so I apologize for that. Let me summarize what Corey was saying. She talked about being very tired. She was having trouble in school. Her normal grades were in the 90s, rarely in the high 80s, and her grades were going down to the 70s. People were looking at her and thinking she was fine and expecting her to do everything normally, and it was taking her much longer to do work. She was easily getting a headache. She was getting tired. And the stress of that whole situation was mounting over time. And eventually, she did come into our program, and we were able to request academic accommodations. I have a video of her mother talking, which we're going to skip since obviously those aren't working very well. And to summarize that, she basically said, yeah, the school was extremely helpful, but they really didn't have a good understanding of what we needed and why we needed it. And it took some education to accomplish that. And that was several years ago that we made that video, and I can say today that I think there's a much better awareness and understanding both in and out of schools about concussion. But I think the academic effects of concussion still are flying a bit under the radar screen more than we'd like. There's still a main emphasis on physical activity and return to sports. And not that that's not important. That's very important, especially for some kids. But we want to make sure we address the student side of the student-athlete equation as well. And again, that's the focus of the talk today. So one last apology for the videos. I won't play the rest. We'll just carry on here with the slides. So to begin with, what is a concussion? Well, a concussion is a mild traumatic brain injury caused by a blow or a jolt to the head. The brain almost always looks normal on a CT scan or MRI. There's really no medical test, no blood test, no imaging test that can show us when the brain is concussed. But we know it's injured because it's not working properly. And usually the way we know it's not working properly is because the person is having trouble thinking, or they have vision problems, or headaches, or sleep problems. There's a fairly defined set of symptoms and signs that help us to know that there's been an injury to the brain. But because there's no medical test, and because, as Corey had said, if you could hear her, she looks fine, concussion is often considered an invisible injury. One of the ways we identify a concussion is if someone loses consciousness. And so we have our first poll question here, which is a concussion usually results in a loss of consciousness. Do you think that's true or false, just out of curiosity?
All right, I'm going to launch that poll question now. Please take a moment to answer. I'll give you a few more seconds to answer. All right, I'm going to close the poll now and share the results. All right, 93% said false, 7% said true.
Right, and the answer is false. Thank you, Carla. When I started working in the area of concussion, there was still a misperception that you could only suffer a concussion if you lost consciousness. That was really the only way we could really call it a concussion. And obviously that's not true, and most people clearly are aware of that now. In high school sports, where we have pretty good data with this because we have athletic trainers on the sidelines, we know that only about 10% of athletes actually lose consciousness. So if you think you have to lose consciousness to have a concussion, you're going to be missing most of those injuries. It's also important to realize that just because a person does or does not lose consciousness is not indicative of the possible severity of that injury. Certainly if there's a prolonged loss of consciousness, that may be the case. But if there's a loss of consciousness of a few minutes versus no loss of consciousness, it really doesn't mean it's a more severe injury necessarily when we see that. Talking about concussion, again, sports gets a lot of attention, especially in the media, but only about 20% of all concussions or mild traumatic brain injuries are sports and recreation related. There's a higher percentage of concussions caused by sports amongst high school and middle school students because they're playing a lot of sports and they have a greater exposure in the sports domain. And we also find that the developing brain may be more vulnerable in that age. Mostly what we see there is a little bit longer recovery time in adolescence. But while sports gets most of the attention, as I said, it's actually falls and motor vehicle accidents that are the leading cause of concussion overall. And we certainly see many non-sport concussions in our schools and with our students. And one of the problems in many cases actually is that a school may have a good influence, particularly concussions that occur in the context of a school-based sport or a school-sponsored sport. But when a student is injured by other means, there may not be the same mechanisms or protocols, and so these students may more likely fly under the radar or not get identified or serviced as soon as we might like. In terms of what happens with a concussion, it's a complex injury that involves both chemical changes and structural changes. There's alterations in blood flow. with new technologies, we're learning so much more about the many different ways that the brain is affected by brain injury, including concussion. I'm not going to go into any in-depth discussion of this today, but suffice it to say that there's multiple different ways that the brain gets injured, and this is one of the things that leads to the tremendous variety that we see across concussions. I recently heard Kevin Guskowitz, who's a leading concussion researcher, describe concussions as like snowflakes, no two are alike. And anybody who works in this area of concussion management certainly is familiar with that. Everybody's brain is different. It reacts differently to the injury. They have different circumstances surrounding them, different histories, and it can become very complicated in terms of how this presents for any individual. Thankfully, most people do recover fairly quickly from a concussion. And overall, for all ages, the general recovery time is about 7 to 10 days. But as I already mentioned, for high school and to some extent middle school kids, we believe that the recovery may actually typically be a little longer. If you combine that with the fact that these younger kids are playing more sports, and sports is an area where we worry about repeat injury because they're going back too soon. If you combine the fact of increased sports participation with prolonged recovery, that's one of the reasons why there's been so much attention to better concussion management in schools, including the proliferation of laws across the country that are really mandating better management of concussion in high school and particularly in sports, including New York State. While most people do recover in a week or two, there's a substantial minority that continue to experience symptoms for much longer, up to 3 months or well beyond that. I was going to play a video of Mike, who's a sophomore in high school, when he dove into the shallow end of a swimming pool at a sectional swim meet here in New York State, and it took him about 15 months to recover fully from his injury. He was unable to go to school for about 10 weeks, lost 15 pounds. He could only tolerate school for half days for about 6 months, and it really took him well over a year before he could say that he felt back to himself. That's an unusual case, but far more common than most people realize. When symptoms do last longer than the normal recovery time, sometimes, as was the case for Mike, it seems like it's just due to the injury. But it's often true that other factors seem to complicate recovery. And the most common things that complicate recovery are getting another injury to the head while you're still not recovered, and that's certainly, again, why there's so much focus in proper return-to-play protocols to prevent that. But we also see clinically that students who don't rest enough or who are trying to do too much, and this is in fact often kids who don't seem to have that severe of an injury, so they don't take it too seriously, they keep going about their business, and as they keep trying to do their schoolwork or play with friends or whatever they're doing, screen time on their computers or phones, they find that they are continuing to experience headaches and dizziness, vision problems, and sometimes these can actually get worse if there's sustained overexertion after the injury. So there's a much greater awareness of that, and in fact, it's that observation by people who work with individuals with concussion that has led to some of the emphasis, growing emphasis now, on limiting mental activity, not just physical activity. So when we say overexertion can complicate recovery, we really mean both physical and mental overexertion. In addition, we see that any kind of stress, which puts a demand on the brain, can cause problems. And for this population, the most common stressors are being taken out of sports, especially if they are good at sports, and that's a big part of their identity. We can't really tell them how quickly they're going to get better. We can't show them a medical test that even shows the injury. So there's a lot of medical uncertainty. And I would say, again, in accord with the emphasis of this talk, that not only academic difficulties, but academic stress, what I would call academic stress. Not only is it harder to focus, it takes more energy, they're working twice as hard to do their homework, but when they experience that and they see their grades going down and they feel like they're not performing well in school, the stress associated with that experience itself will often seem to complicate the recovery from the injury. And in some cases, you will have students who actually develop a clinically significant mental health condition, an anxiety or depressive disorder that comes in reaction to the stress associated with recovering from the injury. It's also true that the injured brain may be less equipped to deal with that stress, so that further increases the risk factor. Besides that, we know that individuals who may have been struggling before injury, such as with a prior traumatic brain injury or TBI, or a psychiatric condition, or some learning or attention disorder, they may seem to have more complicated or difficult recoveries. Likewise, if there's other injuries in addition to the head injury. And the most common co-occurring conditions that we see in our clinic would be injuries to the neck, which can cause a lot of the same symptoms of concussion, such as headaches or dizziness or vision problems. And if there's psychological trauma, such as might be experienced in a motor vehicle accident or an assault or something like that, that psychological trauma and its impact on the mind and brain can sort of aggravate things and make it more difficult in the context of brain injury to recover from either one. So based on this experience and the literature we have now supporting many of these observations, we know that it's important to avoid re-injury until you're recovered. We want to avoid both mental and physical overexertion. And I would add, avoid too much stress during recovery. We know that just knowing what to expect, knowing that this is normal to feel this way, knowing what's going on, that the symptoms are normal, there's some literature to suggest that that makes a big difference, and my own clinical experience certainly would validate that. And there's consensus that when we do return a patient to activity, whether it's school or work or driving or sports, that this should be done under medical supervision so that it can be managed properly. We can reduce the chances of problems and complications and increase the chances of success. So when it comes to what we're going to call return to learn, returning to the classroom, as I said, there's growing evidence that supports the idea that the brain's really not happy after a concussion, and even when symptoms seem to go away, there's evidence to suggest that there's a period of abnormality in brain functioning that lingers. Myself and some colleagues here at Upstate just published a paper following kids with a concussion for up to a year after injury and comparing them with kids who suffered orthopedic injury. And we picked both groups up in the emergency department here. And what we found was that at 3 months post-injury, the concussed kids, these were kids 13 to 18, and still showed abnormalities in visual memory, even though their reported symptoms were no different than the group of kids who suffered orthopedic injury. We haven't published it yet, but our follow-up data shows that by 6 months post-injury, those visual memory differences normalized, so there was no difference between the groups. So that's a pretty specialized or a study looking at a small area, but it's one of a growing number of articles suggesting that there may be lingering problems even when the person seems to look and feel fine. But we don't really have any research specifically looking at what the academic effects of a concussion are. So the things I'm talking about from this point forward in terms of concussion in the classroom and return to learn are really based much more on clinical experience and both our experience with patients and what we share amongst those of us who work with this group of people. And that leads right into our next poll question. How many of you actually work or have contact with students with concussion-related academic problems?
All right, I'm going to launch that poll question now. Please take a moment to answer. Give you about 5 more seconds before I close the poll. All right, I'm closing the poll now and sharing the results. And it looks like 79% answered yes and 21% answered no.
Well, that's certainly a significant majority, Carla. Thank you. So hopefully what I'm talking about today will resonate, certainly with those who have worked with folks. And for those who haven't, you know, I hope this, obviously you're interested because you're tuned into this webinar, so I hope this will help you understand better what's going on with them. So based on what I've already said, it's not surprising that we know that concussion can cause academic problems that lingers for days, weeks, months, or even longer. And I think the other 2 points in this slide we've already covered. Here's another video, which I'm just going to skip. And that was Mike. And one of the, I'm sorry, that was Tracy, who was Corey's mom. And one of the things she talks about, again, was that the school really didn't have a good understanding of what was going on. They were very much interested in helping, and once they sort of knew what they needed to do, they were all over it. But what I find working with schools still, it's certainly much better these days as there's increased awareness, but I still find that oftentimes the schools find themselves in an interesting position where we're saying to them, look, I know this kid can go to school, and a lot of times they can even keep their grades up pretty good. The problem is they're having to work twice as hard to do that because the brain doesn't have the energy, it seems, that it needs. And if you're a teacher or a school administrator and you're just looking at the grades, you might say, well, we don't really need to do much here, and besides, he looks good when he's in school. But what I'm hearing from the child or the parent in our clinic is, yeah, my God, he comes home from school, he's wiped out, he goes to bed, he sleeps for 2 hours, then he wakes up and he does his homework, and that's all he can do, and by the time he's done with his homework, he's exhausted, he goes to bed, and he's going to bed like 2 hours earlier than normal, he's sleeping, it's hard to get him up in the morning. So yeah, his grades are good, but he's a wreck, and he's getting depressed because all he's doing is schoolwork. So what we know is that to help someone like that actually get better from the concussion, we need the school's help in reducing the demands on the injured brain. If we're only focused on grades, that may be misleading. What we really need to say is what's needed not only to keep this child going in school, but also to get them better and put this injury behind them. And what we've learned is that medical professionals like myself need to work together and collaborate with both the family and the school to make that happen. And that idea is not certainly unique to our clinic here, and in fact has really been nicely described and formalized by Dr. Karen McAvoy and others in Colorado who developed the REAP program. REAP standing for, I gotta make sure I get this right, Rest, Educate, Accommodate, and Protect, I believe, or maybe Reduce. But the concept is to do those things for students with concussions who are recovering that are going to help them get better and keep going in school. And I think at the end of the presentation here, Carla will give you a link for where you can get more information out about the REAP program, but it really provides a template.
Yep, and I do have an end slide with some of that information, and there might actually be some people who tuned in for Karen McAvoy's webinar a couple months ago. So this is probably great for them to hear as well. So thank you for sharing, Brian.
Okay. So there have been 4 international conferences in sports concussion. The last one was just at the end of last year in Zurich. But the second one, which was in Prague, actually introduced the concept of cognitive rest and the need to limit scholastic activities. This hasn't been fleshed out too much more in the sports concussion world where these guidelines come from. But so it was almost 10 years ago that the idea of, hey, we got to help these kids, related to what they have to do for school as well. That's not a new idea in the literature, although it certainly has not, reached sort of the public or even schools as much as we would like. But again, I think that's certainly changing over time. So just quickly to go over the symptoms, to help put you in the frame of mind of what it might be like to be a kid going to school with a concussion. You might have a headache. That's the most common symptom, and certainly it's the most common physical symptom. But there are a whole host of physical symptoms. I would say headache, fatigue, sleep problems being the ones that we really see most commonly in the population where symptoms linger, especially. There are vision problems. This is an area where we definitely have increased awareness of and attention to. And often, as is often the case here, these vision problems can be somewhat invisible, meaning that if the student goes to the eye doctor, they'll be told that their eyes are fine. They have normal ocular health. But what they're experiencing are functional vision problems. The eyes aren't working together, the pupils aren't working together, and the brain's not processing the visual information in the same way. So the subjective experience of the patient is that they have double vision, their eyes tire, they're photophobic or bothered by bright light, and they can have things that are showing up in their peripheral vision. They can have words moving and dancing on the page. All sorts of goofy things can happen, and this can obviously significantly impact your experience in school, not just when you're trying to read, but just being in a classroom with the bright light, or having your eyes accommodate from, say, looking at your desk with your notes up to the bright smart board at the front of the class. These things can be very troubling and difficult for the kids, and that can aggravate their symptoms when they're doing that. Irritability is the most common emotional symptom, but again, the brain controls everything, so just about any emotional or behavioral problem we can see after a concussion. And then, of course, the very characteristic cognitive problems. When a student tells us they feel cloudy or foggy or dazed, that's a very characteristic description of the person who's been concussed. They feel like they have cobwebs, they can't shake it out, they feel slow, they have trouble paying attention to things. They actually can't not pay attention to things, so if there's, somebody's tapping their pencil on a desk, that's all they can pay attention to, but they can't stay focused on their reading assignment. Probably one of the most characteristic things, as I've already alluded to, is that even if they can function well, at times they have difficulty sustaining mental exertion because their stamina, their mental stamina, is poor. So they tire much more quickly. They may start out the day feeling good, and by 10:30 they're in the nurse's office, slumped over, ready for a break. When they do get tired, all the symptoms get worse. They can get overloaded, overwhelmed, and it just doesn't feel very good. This concept of getting tired and not tolerating exertion, especially sustained exertion, again has been described now in the literature, and it's recognized that different sorts of stresses can provoke or aggravate the symptoms. And that's one of the reasons, for example, when we're returning an athlete to play after a concussion, when they feel fine, we just don't say, okay, that's great, get out there and go at it. We say, okay, I know you're feeling good, but you really haven't done very much yet. So what we're going to do is we're going to start out with maybe some light exercise, and we're going to wait a day and see how you feel. And if you do okay with that, we'll pick it up and we'll do a little bit more the next day, et cetera, until we can get you back to play. Likewise, we want to take that same kind of mindset and approach to our students recovering from concussion when they go back to the classroom. And I'm going to skip over this slide of Mike He was the young man, as I said, who took 18 months to recover, and he really does a great job of describing the slow increase in his mental stamina that he experienced over the course of his injury. So I'm sorry that you can't see that, but we'll skip over it. So again, I think I've mentioned a lot of these things in terms of what we might see with folks in school. They get tired much more easily. And this particular problem is one of the reasons why these kids can be misunderstood in school, because I often hear students tell me that, well, you know, when I start out school, I feel fine, and so my math teacher thinks I'm perfectly normal because my class is at 9 o'clock. But by the time I get to French class at 1 in the afternoon, I can't even stay awake through the class, so, you know, I had to go talk to the principal because I was falling asleep in class, and so, you know, but now I'm able to take rest breaks in the nurse's office about 10:30. That's really helping me a lot. I'm not so tired in French class. So, you know, if we don't know what we're looking for, it sometimes can be hard to see this. And certainly the students themselves may not think that that's typical of a concussion. If they feel good in the morning, they think, oh, I'm over the concussion. So if I'm tired, it must be something else. So that's a very common one that can be sort of tricky for folks. But in addition, we see that the school environment can be difficult. So even if you can concentrate in class, you may be bothered much more by noise or light. And I don't know how many of you actually work in schools or have the opportunity to be in a high school when the bell rings and the classes change, but it can be a pretty frightening experience for those of us who aren't in school every day. Just, you know, all those kids, you know, streaming out of the classrooms, all the noise, commotion, it can be overwhelming without a concussion. And when you do have one, it can really crank up your symptoms and ruin your day. Similarly, being in the cafeteria can be quite difficult. One of the problems while I'm talking about that, of course, is that where is the most, you know, where's all the action at socially in schools for the kids? It's usually in the cafeteria or maybe in the hallways between classes. So we're telling the kids, you know, maybe if you change classes off schedule, maybe if you eat lunch in a quiet room. For some kids, that's fine. For others, that is a death penalty socially to them because it's pulling them away from their friends. They're already feeling barely enough about themselves. So we have to be careful with things like that. But certainly it's common for the students recovering from concussion to be bothered by all that commotion. Doing more than one thing at a time, very difficult. Kids get overloaded, they shut down. I actually treated a student who in the middle of a class got up and just ran right out of the school. He got so overwhelmed, he just ran right out of the school. They couldn't find him actually, and it turns out he had run just down the street to his church, and the minister of the church happened to be there. So the parents got a call from the minister that the young man was sitting in his office just completely overwhelmed. That's obviously an extreme example, but in a smaller way, it's something we hear all the time. Again, I think I've already covered most of the points on this slide. Later, incomplete homework I put on there because that's something that school teachers, administrators, nurses can be looking for as an indicator that maybe this student is struggling. And if they are aware that there's been a concussion, to maybe poke around and see what's going on and see if there's something that could be done to help. So invisible injury, no medical tests, and also even I've said that the grades look good, and even when we do formal cognitive or neurocognitive testing, even in those cases we may not actually be able to identify problems. I mentioned our study where we looked at kids for up to a year after injury, and at 3 months as a group the kids with the concussion showed memory impairments. But if we had looked at any one of the results of any of one of those kids individually, we might not be able to see anything that looked particularly abnormal. So in group studies we can find it, but on an individual basis it's still very elusive to be able to actually objectively assess these difficulties. And because of that problem, because the kid looks fine, because there's lack of awareness, the message that the child often gets, whether it's from the coach, from the educators, from the parents, or whoever, is that, hey, you look fine, the tests are normal, you just need to suck it up and get over it. And when the child really doesn't feel right, and that's the message they're getting, that can create a discordance inside them that I think, again, contributes to some of the psychological problems that can develop in reaction to what they're going through. Again, sorry, here's another video. We're just going to skip over it. And when that depression or anxiety does emerge, it can reach clinical proportions. And then we have to actually treat that in and of itself, not just the concussion. So now that we have an idea of what goes wrong, and again, remember that for the vast majority of kids, this is a relatively short-lived event. They're over it in a matter of days, maybe a week or 10 days. We really don't need to do much for them, sort of mostly protect them. But in cases of prolonged recovery, and that's more common than most people realize, we need to get into a much more complex kind of set of accommodations and treatments, and that's what I'm going to review today. So when it's short-lived, we certainly do want to maybe pull that kid out of school for a few days, and then when we send them back, we want to make sure we check and see how it's going during the day. Whenever I send kids back for the first time, students back, I recommend mandatory check-ins with the nurse's office. Even if it's going well, that's okay. But if it's not going well, the kids themselves, I've learned, are very reluctant to, if we tell them, listen, take a rest break if you need it, make sure you go to the nurse if you need it. Well, my experience is most students will not do that. And so I've sort of abandoned that approach. And if I have a child in school with concussion, there's usually some kind of mandatory either rest break and or check-in with the school nurse to monitor things, because I find that that's much more effective. But the guidelines I'm going to go over now, I guess my point is that this can play out over the course of a week, or it can play out over the course of a month, or it can play out over the course of a year. It really varies vastly, and one size does not fit all. So out of school at first, and then gradual reentry as they can handle it. Again, avoid re-injury. Don't just think about after-school sports. Think about what's going on in physical education class, what's happening in those hallways and stairwells. We've certainly seen kids who, because they're dizzy, clumsy, poor vision, slowed processing, they're at higher risk for re-injury. We've had them fall down the stairs, other things happen in school. So we want to be careful with that. And we want to make sure we support their academic needs, and we want to make sure people in the school are communicating with each other about the injury, with the family, and with the medical team. Rest breaks I find to be the single most effective intervention for kids who are in school while still having symptoms. And this should be in a quiet place. My parentheses there, it's not always the nurse's office, especially during flu season. It might be a bit chaotic in the nurse's office, but the idea is to have a place where the student can rest. Usually 15 or 20 minutes is enough. Again, I make it mandatory, and I might start out and say, you got to take one mid-morning and one after lunch. Maybe you're going to eat lunch in a quiet room too, and then as you feel better, we can pull back on that. After rest breaks, what we're really looking to do is to recognize that the brain can function, but it takes longer and can't do as much. So the obvious thing to do is to ask it to do less and to try and decrease the demands on the brain. And if work can be deferred, if work can be forgiven, if we can, just do the odd-numbered math problems, not the odd and even-numbered math problems, things like that, we can keep the student going academically while recognizing that they need more rest. And we have to provide the time for that, or we're not going to get through this nearly as well. Avoiding overstimulation, I think I've already covered that point. Extra time, and extra time not just because it may literally take them longer with slowed processing, but also because they may need a rest break in the middle of that exam or assignment where they just have to put their head down or go to the nurse's office just to sort of refresh themselves. And what I should make the point that our clinical experience is that if you give the student rest before the symptoms get too bad and they have to rest, if you try to intervene and get that rest in kind of before they really need it, it actually seems to be much more effective and much less rest is needed than when we wait till the student crashes and they're forced to take a rest break. Then it just seems to take a lot more energy to pick that student up and get them going again, and more than likely they're headed home from school at that point. So it's more disruptive. That's actually another reason for mandatory rest breaks at scheduled times, because then everybody knows they're coming, we can plan for it. The teachers that might be affecting in terms of their classes know about it, so they know they need to figure out how to manage that, and it's just a much better way to handle it. So extra time in a quiet location, giving kids notes, doing two things at the same time, listening to the teacher and taking notes can be difficult. So providing notes is usually helpful. For those who are very light sensitive, let's do something about that. Maybe they want to sit in front because they're more distracted, but maybe they actually feel better sitting in back because they feel kind of very anxious now, and they just feel more comfortable in the back of the room. So preferential seating based on what that particular student may need. Memory, particularly recall of learned information, can be difficult. Not only is it harder to learn, but it may be harder to recall it once you've learned it. So test formats such as recognition formats or open book formats are going to be much better than those that emphasize free recall. And if our focus is really on the conceptual understanding of the material and not making it a memory test for the kid with concussion, then let's see if we can accommodate that. Vision problems may be an indicator for either large print or books on tape, and giving either home tutoring sometimes if needed, or special help in that period at the end of the day, assistance with organizing the work, maybe a check-in, check-out system. One of the symptoms of concussion that we hear very commonly, even if the child or student seems to be able to remember what they've learned, they seem to easily lose track of what they're doing or thinking about. So it kind of looks like a memory problem, but it's almost more of an attention problem where they're doing something and then they get distracted, and then when they come back to what they were doing, it's gone. That little pointer that we have that sort of keeps our place in what we were doing seems to go away for a while. And so they more easily sort of lose track of what's needed. They show up at home and forgot to bring this textbook or their calculator or whatever, or their homework is in their backpack and they forget to turn it into the teacher because they get doing something else, and that little pointer isn't there to say, oh, don't forget to do that at the end of class. So a check-in and check-out system may be useful for those kinds of problems. This question relates to the idea that, so we want to rest these kids, and one question for the group we'd like to pose is, should we be resting them physically completely while they're still recovering? So they've had a concussion, they still have symptoms. Would our recommendation these days be that that student not engage in any physical activity, or should they engage in some physical activity? Let's see what folks think about that.
All right, I'm going to launch that question now. Please take a moment to answer. All right, I'll give you about 5 more seconds before I close the poll. All right, I'm going to close the poll now and share the results. All right, it looks like 71% said false and 29% said true.
Okay, well again, we have a majority of folks who are up to speed in the current literature. This is an interesting question for us here in upstate New York, because when I started treating individuals with concussion 10, 12 years ago, the general thought was that we should minimize physical activity until the person was fully recovered. But thanks in great part to the efforts of John Letty and his colleagues in Buffalo here in New York, they've done research into this area, and we now are much more of the understanding that we should probably rest kids fully if they have symptoms during the first 2 to 3 weeks. But after that, we actually think it may be helpful, particularly for athletes, if we get them exercising. Now, I do have to say that it's important to get them exercising in the right way and to do exercise to what we call sub-symptom thresholds, meaning you can go out for a walk, but if you start to get a headache, you need to stop. And if you could only walk for 15 minutes before that headache came on, then probably for the next week or so, you should just walk for 15 minutes. And then you should push a little bit and see if you can do more. That's kind of the principle. And what the thought is these days is that that exercise may actually promote and encourage the recovery and rehabilitation of the nervous system after injury. But that is a relatively new idea. And particularly with difficult patients, complicated patients, slow to recover patients, an exercise program that's developed and implemented by professionals trained in the research in this area probably is going to make most sense. And in fact, I don't know if I have a slide on this, but I should say in general that when a student has symptoms lasting longer than a week or two, there's a general consensus now that student should be referred and get help from a clinic or a professional who has expertise in concussion management. Most people are already on top of that, so good for you. And we put this slide, and thanks, Carla made up the poll questions and put them in, and she did a great job. Thanks, Carla.
No problem.
Because that leads us right into the discussion about physical education class. And I'm often fighting battles with physical educators because we don't want the kids to be injured, so we certainly don't want them playing dodgeball or things like that. But if they're going through their school day, and for many of these kids, they actually get to a point where they can handle physical activity pretty well. In some cases, well before they're able to handle mental activity. So they may be able to tolerate some exercise and may even be able to participate in many of the non-risky activities of physical education class, even though math still gives them a headache after about 10 minutes. And so in those cases, we actually would like the students to be able to get some exercise during their school day. Maybe it's just going for a walk. Maybe it's doing some light activities or stretching in the gym class or the weight room, maybe some sort of a modified environment. What we probably don't want to be doing is asking them to write papers or do other mental activity when they're still symptomatic, because our goal is actually to try to reduce the mental demands overall. So it may make most sense to have them do whatever activity they can tolerate, see if we can count that for gym. You know, sitting on the bleachers watching the other kids play gym is maybe not contributing to a good psychological state. So try to be creative about how we work with this. Those are my recommendations. Besides physical education class, all the accommodations that we talked about can usually be handled, you know, just by administrative directive because in most cases these supports and accommodations are going to be very short-lived. Certainly, as recovery appears to be becoming complicated, we may want to formalize the accommodation plan. I certainly recommend a meeting with the student and the family regardless of how long it may take. That just seems to really help out, and the sooner you do that, the better. If we need to move to a 504 plan, certainly that's appropriate. And in some cases, although it would certainly be very much the exception, things may be severe enough or prolonged enough that we may want to move to an individualized education plan, but that requires a whole another level of formalization in the school. Some schools automatically put in place a 504 plan and they have templates for that. Others wait until it's been a while. There's a lot of differences in how individual schools prefer to handle this. And there's still a lot of variation in my experience and the experience of others that I speak with who do this kind of work. We see a lot of variety in how schools understand, manage this. The willingness of folks in the schools to help out seems to vary both between schools, within schools. My hunch is that there are kind of multiple reasons for that. Some of that may be still a lack of knowledge. The other is that, the kids look fine and, hey, Johnny was always trying to get over even before the concussion, so I'm not convinced that, he's not just running with this injury, things like that. And certainly sometimes those concerns are legitimate, but more often than not, there continues to be some either misunderstanding or miscommunication about what's going on. So hopefully through webinars like this and other efforts of the Brain Injury Association and other groups, we can create more consistency in the schools and better support our students. I've already mentioned that neuropsychological testing, that's testing of different areas of brain functioning after injuries such as memory or attention. These tests oftentimes don't necessarily show problems at the individual level, but they sometimes do. And as a matter of fact, certainly in the period shortly after the injury, like the first week or two afterwards, where we're more likely to pick up these problems, the results can be very helpful, both in determining whether an athlete may be ready to go back to risky sports and also whether a student might actually be ready to be in the classroom. I've had an experience where a kid will come in and they'll tell you their headache is a 8 out of 10, and 8 out of 10, all 8 out of 10s are not created equal, based on the differences in students and their reports. So for me, sometimes when I'm really on the fence about whether I think this child needs home tutoring or they can tolerate even a half day of school, I may utilize this testing to get a better sense of what their cognitive efficiency really is. So these tests can be useful both in return to learn and in return to play, and computerized testing has proliferated in many schools for assisting return to play decisions. So one of my main recommendations for schools is put together a team that not only involves people from your athletics department, but also your educators, your medical people, your counselors who can help with understanding how to put together a reasonable schedule for the student and maybe provide some emotional support, and educate everyone in your school. I was fortunate to be invited to be this keynote speaker at a local school district here, and it was great to be able to stand up in front of a couple hundred teachers in the district, not just the nurses and the coaches and athletic trainers, and be able to talk about classroom effects. So put together your team, provide education, think about developing both return to play and return to learn policies. And with that, I'm going to conclude, and thank you very much for your attention, and I hope you found this helpful, and I guess Carla's going to take care of the question and answer period here.
Yeah, thank you, Brian. If you want to just advance through those next few slides while I give the audience a quick reminder, just a little bit about the Brain Injury Association. We're a statewide nonprofit membership organization that advocates on behalf of individuals with brain injuries and their families. Brian did mention REAP, but he was a little humble. He did not mention Concussion in the Classroom, which is a wonderful pamphlet that we actually worked together with Brian in Upstate University Hospital to create. So it's a wonderful resource, and as Brian mentioned, REAP is a wonderful resource. To obtain copies of these, to download them for free, I have included the link, and you can find the link on our website as well, www.bianys.org. For hard copies, feel free to contact us. You'll see our contact information on this slide. We do have some upcoming webinars and events. I will not mention all of these, but they are listed, and we do plan, again, like I mentioned before, to post these slides along with the recording on our website. If your question for some reason does not get addressed, please don't let it fall by the wayside. I encourage you to email it to me, and I will be happy to get them to Brian. Again, you will receive my contact information in a follow-up email from GoToWebinar. Okay, we can begin the question and answer period now. So if you have a question, I already have a few piling up. Please feel free to send it. We have about 15 minutes left. Brian, my first question is, how long would you say the restriction should be held during recovery? How long for a recovery period? I think you mentioned this a little bit, but if you wanted to restate what you had said before.
So you said how long should the restriction be held? I'm not sure what you mean there.
I'm not sure if they're meaning
physical activity?
Yeah.
Yes. Right now, that's a good question. So right now, and again, for better information on this, you can contact John Letty and his colleagues in Buffalo, because they're really leading this area of research. But right now, the consensus is that probably for a person who still has concussion symptoms, during the first 2 to 3 weeks after injury, we should probably limit physical activity, quite a bit. Certainly if they only have minimal symptoms, it would be okay to get them going back to some things. But during that first 2 to 3 week period, we probably want to clamp down, especially if they have more significant symptoms. After the 2 to 3 week period, we actually should begin to turn around and try to get some exercise going if they can tolerate it. Some kids will be feeling so badly it won't make sense to even try to do too much. They might be very dizzy. We don't want them falling over. But if we feel like they can handle it, promoting some physical activity at that point would be recommended, as long as it's understood that we really have to be careful not to overdo it. And if the student develops any symptoms, they should stop and rest.
All right, thank you, Brian. I have another question here, and this is something else you talked briefly about. What is the evidence base for the effect of mental overexertion?
Right now, there's very limited evidence for that. There's a couple of studies that have demonstrated that kids or athletes in particular who have gotten back to activity versus those who are still resting, that of those kids who have gotten back to activity, those doing more activity perform worse on neurocognitive testing versus those doing maybe a moderate amount of activity at the same period post-injury. So that was a study done by the Pittsburgh group a while ago. That's an example, but really there's very limited evidence base for this. I think there's a lot of clinical experience and anecdotal research that does support this, and I think over the next several years, the problem is right now it's sort of hard to figure out how to measure this, to be honest with you, having tried to do some of this myself. So it's limited now, but hopefully that will improve.
I received, it's kind of a story actually from one of the attendees. Her 9-year-old son had a concussion and he followed the return to play protocol with no physical symptoms. Later they realized that he had academic, sleep, and emotional issues and was ineffective playing his sport. And I think this came out in some of the examples you provided. This individual said that she realized in hindsight that the return to learn was very important, and I guess he sustained a second concussion, and she found that the return to learn first, actually implementing that, was much more effective in his recovery, and she says that she's seen literature about transitioning to school. However, it makes it seem, and I've seen this too, and Brian, we've talked about this, like it's an optional thing, the return to learn, and that she feels that return to learn should precede return to play, and that it should be included in the legislation.
Yes, well, obviously that's a person after my own heart there. I certainly agree with those comments, and those kind of stories are what we hear all the time in our clinic. And it's very common to see that kids can tolerate physical activity and get back to their sport, even though they're still having trouble with reading or with sleep, as she mentions. And right now we don't have the kind of protocol we can put the kid through to test that, because even our neurocognitive tests may not reveal those difficulties. So it's very important to get in early, to educate the family, the teachers, to know what to look for, to recognize the importance of return to learn, as this person has pointed out. So I certainly second those comments, and very much consistent, not just with what she saw in her child, but what we see with many kids in our clinic.
Thank you, and I agree.
I don't know if the legislation, the guidelines put a lot of emphasis, that the State Education Department wrote, put a lot of emphasis on return to learn in New York State at least, but you know, it may be a while before this gets into the laws.
I agree, but education is definitely the first step at least. So thank you for sharing your experiences. Another question I have is, how do you feel about brain games? This is actually an interesting question. On the computer to improve memory, do you think it helps or hinders?
Well, this is an interesting area. To summarize my understanding of the research in this area, brain games are good at getting you better at brain games, but they're not necessarily good at getting you better at other things. So if you want to get better at reading and at math, you should work on reading and math. Whether or not it's going to be helpful to do a memory test on a computer to help your reading comprehension or your ability to memorize biology facts, that's a little less clear. And there's not, I would say there's limited support for that idea. And for the most part, with students recovering from concussion, I think energy is better spent accommodating the children and teaching them strategies to help them adapt with their problems during their recovery period, than rather than, say, spending time trying to strengthen attention or memory. I'm not convinced that those things aren't helpful, but I think there's limited research support for that right now. And given that in most cases the symptoms of a concussion do go away and are transient, it's probably better, again, to focus on accommodating folks, developing strategies to deal with the problems while they're there, and then hopefully things improve over time.
Thank you, Brian. I have another question from an attendee. Do you know of any test format that is better for a student post-concussion? It's an interesting question.
Well, and I like that question because it brings up the question of the incredible variety of problems that we see. So let's say I said, well, why don't we deliver the test orally? Maybe that's the best format. Well, for some kids, they don't have any vision problems, but their auditory processing may be affected. such that they're having trouble discriminating complex auditory information that's presented to them. So maybe oral is not going to be a good way for them. Likewise, maybe they can hear, maybe their hearing's not going to be good, but they, or rather maybe they have vision problems. So maybe the oral presentation is going to be better, such as books on tape or something. So I think there really is not a one-size-fits-all. There's certainly a selected set of problems. So I would say test formats that minimize memory demands, like I said, and which are not speeded, where we're not testing memory and speed and recall. Those things are often most affected. Additionally, one thing I did not mention is that if you're going to give writing assignments or essays, that can be very difficult for the kids, and they'll often say that they know what they want to say, they just can't put their thoughts into words. That's such a common experience. And what seems to help with that is to break down essay questions, let's say, into structured chunks, so that, you know, the smaller the bite that they have to organize, the better. If they have to think about the whole essay and get it organized in their head before they can start writing the first paragraph, that's going to be quite problematic. So recognizing that you could have vision issues, that you could have auditory processing issues, you could have organizational problems, memory problems, processing speed, finding out what seems to be the issue for this particular student. And, you know, I'm not an educator, so that's again where we need the help of you educators to think, well, given that problem, what might be the best test format? Maybe there's a special educator in your building who could be helpful with that.
Thank you, Brian. Another question I have, how do you clinically differentiate ADHD from concussion? Often seems like a chicken and egg complexity in diagnosis and management.
Well, that's a very good question. And as far as the chicken and egg goes, there's research to suggest that individuals with a history of ADHD are more likely to get a concussion, perhaps due to inattentiveness or impulsivity or a greater sort of interest in physical activity. Likewise, those with a history of concussion are more likely to be diagnosed with ADHD. And we often say that concussion is the acquired version of ADHD. ADHD is developmental in nature, we believe, but a concussion can cause very similar problems. So when it comes to teasing those apart, I guess what you really are going to look for is, was there a history of attention or you know, hyperactivity or whatever? Was there a history of that prior to the injury, or did these problems start at the time of injury? And in some cases, like the young man I just saw last week, he has a family history of ADHD. He himself was never diagnosed with it, but after his third sports-related concussion, he never really seemed to recover fully, described himself as more distractible, he had more sleep problems, and when he got through high school okay because he's a very bright kid, but when he got to college, things really fell apart. And in his case, it's probably that he had some predisposition towards ADHD that was amplified or aggravated by his history now of multiple concussions, and we ended up with a recommendation of neurostimulant medication, and that turned out to be quite helpful for this young man.
Thank you, Brian. We are running out of time. I can do a couple more questions, but I still have a bunch that have probably we won't have time to address. Please send these to me. I know Brian would love to help. And I would love to help. So if we can help.
These are very good questions, by the way.
They're very good questions. I don't want them to go unanswered. But I'll do a few more before we end this. I'm sure Brian has to go. How does the school manage students with extreme aggressive behaviors and running after a TBI? I don't know if you're familiar with any of this, Brian.
Yeah, actually, a student with extreme aggressive behaviors after a concussion was part of how I got interested in this. I had a family approach me many years ago, and my experience had been working with individuals with more severe brain injuries up to that point. But it was a young man who was having a lot of aggressive behavior, and there was no history of this prior to the injury. And it turned out to be a complicated story, but certainly the concussion seemed to cause what we call emotional and behavioral dysregulation. So the young man was simply not as in control of his emotions or behaviors due to the injury as he would have been before. That combined with some circumstances that caused more stress really led to some very significant behavioral problems. So in terms of managing these kinds of issues, my primary recommendation is to think about what are the situations and circumstances where the problem behaviors are occurring. And also, let's try to stay focused on what we as the educators or adults can change, not on what the child with the injury necessarily has to change, because when your brain is injured, you may be in a poor position to make those changes. So off the top of my head, I'll tell you that the most common issues that we see are the kid is misunderstood and is getting overly tired or overly stimulated in the school environment. And with that, there's decreasing control of behavior, increasing frustration, and it leads to explosiveness in some cases. So my recommendation for something like that is to see if we can provide more rest, if we can reduce stimulation and stress, and definitely let's get that student to a specialized concussion program, because medications or other therapies may be able to help as well. Certainly a difficult case, never an easy solution, but those would be my primary recommendations.
Thank you, Brian. Just two more questions. What about diffuse tensor imaging in terms of better diagnoses? What are your feelings on that?
Yeah, diffusion tensor imaging is getting a lot of press right now. It's the hot new technology, and it's really completely changing the way we understand this injury. So there's a growing body of literature. I certainly would urge you to dig into that yourself if you're really interested in this. What I can tell you is it's not yet ready for prime time when it comes to clinical use on an individual level. So right now, diffusion tensor imaging is showing, and for those of you who don't know, this is kind of the newest, hottest MRI technology. So it's imaging technology, but it can image individual white matter tracts in the brain. And we're finding evidence of injury where we really weren't able to before. And in many cases, we're able to correlate that injury with the problems and symptoms that we see. Right now, as I said, it's research-based, so we don't use it in our clinic. We're not able to use it to help us understand what's going on with any individual, but there's a lot of interest in moving this technology towards clinical use. It's sort of recognized that it's going to have great value, so I think it's only a matter of time. But it's great stuff.
Thank you, Brian. The last question, we're a little over already. Again, please send these to me. They're great questions. This question I thought was interesting. With mandatory daily check-in at the school nurse's office, what types of questions need to be asked of the student?
Well, that's a good question, and I guess I've been recommending mandatory check-ins at the nurse's office and haven't really thought about what those nurses should be doing. School nurses in general, I have to say, seem to have a pretty good handle on what they should do. They often know the kids already. They're usually more up to speed on all of this than anybody else, not necessarily anybody else in the school, but then a lot of other people in the school. So maybe best to ask your school nurse. But my thought would be really to kind of check in with the student about their symptoms. So how you feeling? You know, and don't assume that the student knows what is or is not a concussion symptom. So if you say how you're feeling, they say pretty good, we don't leave it at that. We might want to say, so how was your headache today? Are you noticing that you seem a little more tired than usual? Have you noticed that you seem to be more impatient or frustrated? How about your concentration? So maybe go through a list of symptoms with that kid. You know, there's always some concern about planting the idea of symptoms in kids' heads. I think that's true in some cases, but for the most part, it's more common that kids either are reluctant to talk about their symptoms, they don't want to be whining about it, or they simply don't even know what the symptoms of a concussion are. So if they think they're at the nurse's office because they have a concussion, they might not think to say, yeah, I've been waking up 2 or 3 times a night lately, because they don't have any thought that that might be connected to their concussion, or that they're having trouble putting their thoughts into words, or that they're bothered by the smart board because, you know, before the injury they were supposed to get their eyes checked. They may have needed glasses, so maybe it's just that. So I think finding out how they're doing, and really the educated nurse will know what questions to ask to help see if they can dig out of the kid a bit more than the kid might offer on his or her own, how they're actually doing and how things might be going in school.
All right, unfortunately we are a little over, so unfortunately that concludes our webinar presentation for today. Thank you all again for participating. Thank you, Brian. It's always a pleasure to hear you speak, so thank you for being with us today.
Thank you, Carla.
I hope everyone has a wonderful day, and please tune in to our future webinars. Thank you again.